Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet visit with the past. In tonight's Spiced, we'll step into another world, familiar in its humanity, yet distant in theme. Maybe you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow. Or perhaps you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you found your way here, I'm thankful. I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time of day it is for you. The idea of this quiet story floating across the world always makes smile. If these bedtime journeys through history bring you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. Welcome to Famine Street, where hunger wasn't just a feeling. It was a death sentence that stalked every corner of Dublin during Ireland's darkest hour. Have you ever wondered what it actually looked like when an entire population starved to death? Not the sanitized version from history books, but the raw, brutal reality of familiars watching each other waste away. Well, today we're going to walk those streets together. And I'm going to show you exactly what the Great Famine looked like through the eyes of real people who lived it, breathed it, and many who died from it. But before we step into those dark alleys, let me tell you why this story matters more than you think. The Irish potato famine wasn't just some distant historical event. It was a catastrophe that reshaped entire nations, sent millions fleeing across oceans, and left scars that Ireland carries to this day. By the time we're done, you'll understand not just what happened, but how a single crop failure turned into one of Europe's worst humanitarian disasters. And here's what makes this story even more incredible. I'm going to take you inside the actual experiences of families like the O'Briens, the Murphys, and the Kellys, real people whose names have been forgotten by history, but whose stories reveal the true horror and resilience of human nature when pushed to its absolute limits. So, let's begin our journey back to 1847 Dublin, where every street corner tells a story of survival and a very empty doorway holds the ghost of someone who didn't make it. The year 1847 would become known as Black 47. But to understand why Dublin's streets filled with the dying, we need to go back just a bit further. Ireland in the 1840s was a powder keg waiting to explode. 8 million people crammed into a country smaller than South Carolina, and the rest terrifying part. Nearly half of them depended almost entirely on one single crop for survival, the potato. Now, you might think that sounds crazy. How could an entire population bet everything on one food? But here's what you have to understand. Potatoes weren't just cheap and filling. They were perfect for Ireland's situation. A small plot of land could feed a large family for an entire year. 1 acre of potatoes could sustain a family of 6, while that same acre of grain could barely feed 2 people. For the poor, and we're talking about millions of people here, potatoes weren't just the main course. They were breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Day after day, month after month, year after year, an adult man would eat between 12 to 14 pounds of potatoes every single day. Can you imagine that? 14 pounds of potatoes ate your entire diet. But this dependency created the perfect storm. When disease struck the potato crop in 1845, it wasn't just a bad harvest. It was the collapse of an entire way of life. The disease came like a thief in the night. Farmers would go to bed with fields of healthy green potato plants and wake up to find their crops blackened and rotting. The stench was unbearable. Imagine the smell of millions of pounds of rotting vegetables under the hot sun, and that putrid odor hanging over entire counties like a fog of death. Patrick Murphy was one of those farmers. He lived just outside Dublin with his wife, Bridget, and their 4 children, Mary, age 12, Thomas, 10, little Kathleen, 7, and baby Shaw, barely 2 years old. Patrick had rented a small plot of land, maybe 1.5 acres, and like his father before him, he planted it entirely with potatoes. In September 1845, Patrick walked out to check his crop, expecting to start the harvest that would feed his family through the winter. Instead, he found his entire field destroyed. Black, slimy, stinking potato plants as far as could see. In a single night, his family's survival for the next year had literally rotted into the ground. Others what made Patrick's situation even worse. He still owed rent to his landlord. No potatoes meant no income, but the landlord didn't care about crop failures. Rent was due regardless. So Patrick faced an impossible choice. Use what little money he had saved to pay rent and keep his home, or buy food to keep his family from starving. He chose to pay the rent. After all, winter was coming and a family of 6 couldn't survive on Dublin's streets in the cold. But that decision meant stretching their meager food supplies thinner and thinner with each passing day. By December 1845, the Murphy family had been reduced to 1 small meal a day. Bridget would boil whatever scraps she could find, made some turnips, a bit of cabbage, occasionally a handful of oats if Patrick could find work for a day or so. The children's cheeks grew hollow, their eyes sunken. Little Shaw, the baby, cried constantly from hunger. But Bridget's milk had dried up weeks earlier because she herself was starving. But the Murphys were not alone. All across Dublin, similar scenes played out in thousands of homes. The narrow streets and cramped tenements of the city began filling with families who had fled the countryside, hoping to find work, food, or help in Ireland's capital. What they found instead was a city already overwhelmed by its own hungry population. James Street, Thomas Street, the Liberties. These areas that had once bustled with commerce, and life began to transform into something resembling an open-air morgue. Families huddled indoorways too weak to move. Children wandered the streets alone, their parents either dead or too sick to care for them. And then came the winter of 1846, and everything got worse. Mary O'Brien was 14 years old when her world collapsed. She lived with her grandmother in a single room on Francis Street in the heart of Dublin's Liberties district. Her parents had died of fever the previous summer, leaving Mary to care for her 70-year-old grandmother, who was slowly going blind. Every morning, Mary would venture out onto the streets looking for work, for food, for anything that might keep them out of another day. She would walk from shop to shop, begging for scraps, offering to sweep floors or carry packages for just a crust of bread. Most days she came home empty-handed, but Mary was resourceful in the way that only desperation can make a person resourceful. She learned which streets had the best chance of dropped food, which alleys might hide a forgotten vegetable, which times of day offer a slim possibility of charity. She became an expert in survival, reading the city like a map of potential. Salvation. On Francis Street, Mary watched families dipper one by one. The Kellys in the room next door, gone by February. The Flanagans downstairs. The father died first, and the mother, leaving 3 small children who vanished into Dublin's maze of orphanages and workhouses, if they were lucky. The sound that haunted Mary most wasn't screaming or crying. It was the silence, the gradual quieting of a building as families either died or abandoned their homes to search for help elsewhere. Rooms that had once echoed with conversation, arguments, children's laughter, and babies crying slowly fell into an eerie quiet that seemed to press against the walls like a living thing. Mary's grandmother, weak and nearly blind, would sit by their tiny window and describe what she remembered of better times. She would tell Mary about harvest festivals, about weddings that lasted 3 days, about neighbors helping neighbors build homes and raise children. These stories became Mary's lifeline, proof that the world hadn't always been this way, hope that it might someday be different again. But by spring of 1847, even hope was becoming a luxury that Mary couldn't afford. The streets of Dublin during this period weren't just filled with the hungry, they were filled with the dying. And here's what makes this even more heartbreaking. Many of these people had been prosperous just 2 years earlier. Small farmers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, people who had worked hard, paid their bills, raised their children, and contributed to their communities. That the famine didn't just target the already poor. It dragged down entire social classes. Thomas Kelly had been a blacksmith. Strong hands, broad shoulders, the kind-off man who could shoe a horse or repair a plow with skill that had been passed down through generations. He lived on Cook Street with his wife Ellen and their twin boys, Michael and Daniel, both 8 years old. When famine began, Thomas thought his trade would protect his family. After all, people always needed metal work, repairs, horseshoes. But as the crisis deepened, he discovered a terrible truth. When people are starving, they didn't fix their tools. They sell them for food. By 1847, Thomas's forge had been cold for months. His powerful hands, once steady and sure, now shook from weakness. Ellen had sold everything they owned piece by piece. First her wedding ring, then their furniture, then Thomas's precious tools. Finally, they were forced to leave their home when they couldn't pay rent. Joining the growing population of homeless families wandering Dublin streets, the Kelly twins, Michael and Daniel, were among the thousands of children who became the most visible face of Dublin's suffering. They would stand outside churches and shops, not begging. Their parents had taught them better than that. But simply standing there, their enormous eyes and their gaunt faces, telling a story that words couldn't capture. Ellen Kelly watched her sons grow thinner each day and made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She brought them to the Dublin Union Workhouse and surrendered them to the authorities. The workhouse was overcrowded, understaffed, and disease-ridden. But at least there was a chance they might be fed. The last time Ellen saw her boys, they were standing in a line with dozens of other children, waiting to be processed into the workhouse system. Michael, the braver of the twins, waved at his mother. Daniel clung to his brother's hand and wouldn't look back. Ellen never saw them again. Stories like Ellen Kelly's were playing out across every neighborhood in Dublin. But the true horror wasn't just individual tragedy. It was the systematic breakdown of everything that held society together. When people are desperate enough, civilization itself begins to crumble. By the summer of 1847, Dublin had become a city, where the unthinkable had become routine. Families fought over scraps of rotting vegetables. Children as young as 5 roamed the streets in packs, stealing whatever they could find. The police themselves, underfed and unpaid, could barely maintain order as desperation turned ordinary citizens into people they no longer recognized. But perhaps nowhere was this breakdown more visible than in the markets and food distribution centers that had once been the heart of Dublin's economy. Corkhill Market had been a place of abundance for generations. Farmers from the surrounding countryside wild bring their produce to sell to Dublin's merchants and families. The air would fill with the calls of vendors hawking everything from fresh bread to salted fish, from milk still warm from the cow to vegetables pulled from the ground that very morning. Now, in 1847, Corkhill Market had become something else entirely. A desperate gathering place where the starving came to fight over whatever meager supplies might arrive. Seamus O'Sullivan had been a fish seller at Corkhill for 23 years. He knew every regular customer, every merchant, every farmer who brought goods to sell. He had watched children grow up, celebrated weddings, mourned deaths. The market wasn't just his livelihood. It was his community. But by Black 47, Seamus rarely had fish to sell. Boats that had once brought fresh catches from Dublin Bay now sat empty in the harbor because the fishermen were too weak to work, or because they had died, or because they had fled to America like so many others. When Seamus did manage to get his hands on a few fish, he faced an agonizing decision: sell them for the pittance people could afford, or keep them to feed his own starving family. The day that broke Seamus's heart came in August 1847. A shipment of grain had arrived at the market. Not much, maybe enough to feed 50 families for a week. Word spread throughout Dublin's streets like wildfire, and by dawn, hundreds of people had gathered around Seamus's stall and the few others that might have food. What happened next wasn't a market transaction. It was a riot. Desperate mothers fought with their bare hands for a handful of grain. Men who had once been neighbors turned on each other with a savagery that shocked even Seamus, who had seen months of gradual social collapse. A woman named Catherine Barn, who had 5 children at home, was trampled by the crowd and died right there on the cobblestones just 10 feet from the food that might have saved her family. Seamus watched the woman die and made a decision that would haunt him forever. He closed his stall, gathered what little food he had left, and walked away from Corkhill Market. He never returned, but the markets weren't the only places where Dublin's social fabric was tearing apart. The city's religious institutions, which had always been a source of comfort and community support, were overwhelmed beyond their capacity to help. Father Michael Unell had served St. Ordowan's Church for 12 years. He had baptized babies, married young couples, buried the elderly, and provided comfort to his parish through good times and bad. He thought he understood suffering until the famine showed him depths of human misery he had never imagined possible. Every morning, Father O'Connell would open the church doors to find dozens of families huddled on the steps. They weren't there for morning mass. They were there because the church steps were one of the few places in Dublin where they might find shelter and safety during the night. Many were too weak to stand when the sun rose. The church had a small fund for helping the poor, money that had been carefully saved over years to help families through temporary hardships. Father O'Connell distributed every penny of it in the first month of the famine. After that, he began giving away his own possessions, his extra clothes, his books, even the silver communion chalice that had belonged to the church for over a century. But what tormented Father O'Connell most weren't the requests for help. It was the confessions. People came to him not seeking absolution for sins of commission, but for sins of survival. A mother confessed to letting her weakest child die so she could save the stronger ones. A father confessed to stealing from his. Neighbors already empty lauder-got children confessed to leaving their sick parents behind when they became too much of a burden to carry. These weren't evil people. These were ordinary human beings pushed beyond the limits of what any person should have to endure, making choices that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. Father O'Connell found himself offering forgiveness for acts of desperation that he wasn't sure God himself could understand. Was 11 years old, and the baby little Patrick was barely 6. Flynn brought her baby brother to the church. Margaret. The breaking point came when young Margaret, months old. Their parents had died the week before, and Margaret had been carrying her brother from street to street, looking for someone who could help them survive. Father O'Connell looked at the baby and knew immediately that Patrick was dying. Malnutrition had already begun shutting down his tiny body. His eyes were dull. His skin had taken on the grayish color that marked the final stages of starvation. Margaret, herself skeletal and weak, begged the priest to save her brother. Father O'Connell held that dying baby and realized that all his years of theological training, all his faith, all his prayers meant nothing in the face of systematic starvation. He had no food to give them. He had no medicine. He had no miracle. All he could do was hold a 80-inch child and watch his sister's heart break. Baby Patrick died in Father O'Connell's arms 3 days later. Margaret Flynn disappeared into Dublin streets and was never seen again. These individual tragedies were multiplied thousands of times across Dublin, but they were happening against the backdrop of something even more devastating: the complete failure of the systems that were supposed to protect people in times of crisis. The Dublin Union Workhouse had been designed to house maybe 800 people in times of extreme need. By the summer of 1847, over 3,000 people were crammed into its halls and yards. The smell of unwashed bodies, disease, and death hung over the building, like a cloud that could be detected from blocks away. Inside the workhouse, families were separated. Men in one section, women in another, children in a third. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a desperate attempt to control overcrowding and disease. But for families already traumatized by starvation and loss, this separation often became the final blow that destroyed whatever hope they had left. Anna Murphy, no relation to Patrick Murphy we met earlier, had been a seamstress before the famine. She lived in a tiny room above a tailor's shop on Capel Street with her daughter Rose. Ho was 9 years old and had been born with a twisted leg that made walking difficult. When Anna could no longer pay rent and could no longer find work, she brought Rose to the workhouse, believing it was their only chance for survival. The workhouse officials separated them immediately. Anna was sent to the women's section to work in the laundry, 14 hours a day in hot, humid conditions that left her exhausted and sick. Rose was placed in the children's section where she was expected to pick apart old rope to make oak, work that was nearly impossible for her because of her disability. Anna was allowed to see her daughter for 1 hour each Sunday after chapel services. During those precious 60 minutes, she would hold Rose and try to convince both of them that things would get better, that this was temporary, that they would survive this together and someday leave the workhouse behind. But Rose was getting sicker. Each week, the mega workhouse diet and the grueling work were too much for her small, disabled body. Her cough grew worse, her fever higher. Anna begged the workhouse medical officer to let her care for her daughter, but the rules were strict. Exceptions could be made, or the entire system would collapse under the weight of special cases. On a gray October morning in 1847, Anna Murphy was told that her daughter had died during the night. Rose had been buried in the workhouse cemetery in an unmarked grave with dozens of other children who had died that week. Anna was given no time to grieve. She was expected to return to the laundry immediately or face punishment for shirking her duties. Anna Murphy worked in that laundry for another 3 months. And then one morning, she simply wasn't there anymore. No one knew if she had died or escaped or been transferred to another institution. In the chaos of the workhouse system, people disappeared regularly, and keeping accurate records had become impossible. But the workhouse wasn't the only institution failing under thinner mouse pressure of the crisis. Dublin's hospitals, already overcrowded and undersupplied, became places where people went to die rather than to be healed. Dr. James Crawford had worked at Dublin's Meath Hospital for 8 years. He had treated everything from broken bones to difficult childbirths, from fevers to industrial accidents. He considered himself a competent physician who could handle whatever medical challenges came through his doors. Famine taught Dr. Crawford that all his medical training was useless against systematic starvation. He could set bones and stitch wounds, but he couldn't cure hunger. He could diagnose diseases, but he couldn't treat patients who were dying from malnutrition while simultaneously fighting typhus, dysentery, and a dozen other illnesses that attacked bodies too weak to resist. The hospital had been designed to treat maybe 60 patients at a time. By late 1847, Dr. Crawford was trying to care for over 200 people, most of them dying, with medical supplies that had run out months earlier. Patients lay on the floors and hallways, every bed was occupied. The smell of death permeated every room, every corridor, every corner of the building. Dr. Crawford began keeping a journal during this period, not for medical purposes, but because he needed some way to process what he was witnessing. His entries from late 1847 reveal the psychological toll that the famine was taking on everyone, not just the victims. He wrote about patients who begged him to let them die quickly, rather than prolonging their suffering. He wrote about families who brought their sick relatives to the hospital and then never returned because they couldn't afford toffee another mouth. He wrote about his own dreams, which had become filled with the faces of patients he couldn't save. Perhaps most heartbreaking were Dr. Crawford's observations about the children. He wrote extensively about a little girl named Molly Flanagan, who was brought to the hospital suffering from severe malnutrition. Molly was 7 years old, but she weighed less than 30 pounds. Her hair had fallen out in patches, her teeth were loose, and her stomach was grotesquely distended from starvation. What struck Dr. Crawford most about Molly wasn't her physical condition. He had seen dozens of children in similar states. What haunted him was her behavior. She never cried, never complained, never asked for her parents. She would lie in her bed staring at the ceiling with enormous eyes that seemed to hold all the world's sadness. When Dr. Crawford would examine her, she would thank him politely in a voice barely above a whisper. Molly Flanagan died on a Tuesday. Morning in November 1847, Dr. Crawford was holding her hand when she passed away, and her last words were, "Thank you for being kind to me." She was buried in a mass grave with 11 other children who had died that week. Dr. Crawford's journal entry that night was just 3 words: "I am broken." These stories of individual suffering were playing out against a backdrop of political indifference that made the tragedy even more unbearable. While Dublin's streets filled with the dying, the British government's response revealed a callousness that shocked even hardened observers of the time. Charles Trallion, the British Treasury official responsible for famine relief, believed that the crisis was God's way of teaching the Irish a lesson about self-reliance. From his comfortable office in London, he wrote that the famine was a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, and that too much aid would only make the Irish dependent on charity. But what did this political philosophy look like when it hit Dublin streets? It meant that while ships loaded with Irish grain sailed out of Dublin Sherbourne bound for England, families starved within sight of the docks. It meant that public works projects were designed not to actually help people, but to ensure that no one could receive aid without working for it, even if that work was completely pointless. The most infamous of these projects was the construction of roads that led nowhere. All across Dublin's outskirts, you could see gangs of skeletal men breaking rocks and moving dirt to build roads that started in empty fields and ended in empty fields. The work paid barely enough to buy a single meal, and men would collapse from exhaustion while performing labor that served no purpose, except to satisfy the government's requirement that relief recipients must work. John O'Reilly had been a carpenter before the famine, skilled at building everything from kitchen tables to barn roofs. When his family faced starvation, he joined one of these work gangs, spending 12 hours a day, breaking stones for a road that everyone knew would never be completed. His hands, once steady and precise with wood and tools, became bloody and raw from handling sharp rocks. His back, which had served him well through 20 years of carpentry, began to give out under the strain of work that destroyed rather than created. Every evening, John would drag himself home to his wife Sarah and their 3 children, carrying the few pence he had earned that day. Sarah would take those coins and perform her own daily miracle, somehow stretching them into a meal that would keep the family alive for one more day. A handful of oats, maybe some milk if they were lucky, occasionally a small piece of salted pork. That cost more than John earned in 3 days of back-breaking labor. The children, Timothy aged 10, Catherine 8, and little James just 5, learned to divide even these meager portions among themselves with a fairness that would have impressed Solomon. Timothy, as the oldest, would often pretend he wasn't hungry. so his younger siblings could have larger shares. Catherine became expert at making their single daily meal last as long as possible, taking tiny bites and chewing slowly to make the food seem more substantial. But by December 1847, even these survival strategies weren't enough. John O'Reilly collapsed while working on the pointless road project, his body simply unable to continue. The work supervisor, a man named William Thompson, who had grown wealthy from government contracts to oversee these projects, looked down at John's unconscious form and made a decision that revealed everything about how the famine relief system actually worked. Instead of calling for medical help, Thompson simply crossed John's name off the work roster. No more work meant no more pay, and no more pay meant the O'Reilly family would have to find another way to survive or die trying. Sarah O'Reilly spent the next week carrying her husband from door to door, begging for help, for work, for anything that might keep their family from complete destitution. But Dublin was full of families in identical situations. Every doorway already sheltered the desperate. Every potential employer lady had more applicants than positions. Every source of charity had been exhausted months earlier. The breaking point came when little James, the 5-year-old, began showing the signs that every parent in Dublin had learned to recognize with horror. His hair started falling out in clumps. His belly became grotesquely swollen while the rest of his body wasted away. His eyes took on that glassy, distant look that meant his body was beginning to shut down. Sarah made the same impossible decision that thousands of other mothers were making across Dublin. She took James to the founding hospital in James Street and surrendered him to the nuns, hoping that institutional care might save him when family love could not. The founding hospital had been designated as a place where unwanted babies could be left safely, ensuring they would be cared for rather than abandoned. By 1847, it had become something entirely different, a repository for children whose parents could no longer keep them alive. Sister Mary Catherine had worked at the founding hospital for 15 years. She had cared for hundreds of children, watching them grow from helpless infants into young people ready to make their way in the world. She took pride in her work, believing that she was providing love and care to society's most vulnerable members. The famine turned Sister Mary Catherine's calling into a nightmare. The hospital was overflowing with children whose parents had either died or been forced to surrender them. Many of these children arrived already dying, and the hospital lacked the resources to save them. Sister Mary Catherine found herself presiding over what amounted to a children's hospice, watching dozens of young lives flicker out despite her best efforts. Little James O'Reilly arrived at the hospital on a cold December morning, carried in his mother's arms. Sarah had dressed him in his only clean clothes, a shirt that had once belonged to his older brother, and trousers that were now far too large for his wasted frame. She held him tightly for a few minutes in the hospital's reception area, whispering promises that she would come back for him when things got better. Promises that both she and Sister Mary Catherine knew were probabilities, meant to comfort a dying child. James was placed in a ward with 30 other children, most of them suffering from various stages of malnutrition and disease. The ward that had once echoed with the sounds of healthy children playing and laughing had become eerily quiet. These children didn't have the energy for games or noise. They lay in their beds staring at nothing, occasionally whimpering softly when the hunger pains became too intense. Sister Mary Catherine did everything she could for James. She fed him tiny spoonfuls of thin GRL, hoping to gradually strengthen his digestive system without overwhelming it. She bathed his fevered body with cool cloths when twos joined the malnutrition in attacking his small frame. She held him during the long nights when he cried for his mother, providing what comfort she could to a child who was slowly starving to death in an institution designed to save him. James O'Reilly died on Christmas Eve, 1847, He was buried in the hospital's small cemetery in a grave, marked only with a wooden cross that bore his first name and the date of his death. Sarah never learned of her son's fate. She had died 2 weeks earlier, collapsing in the street while searching for work to feed her remaining children. But the individual tragedies were only part of the horror. What made Dublin's famine experience uniquely devastating was the way it exposed the brutal mathematics of social hierarchy. Even in the midst of widespread starvation, some people continued to live in comfort, while others died just blocks away. The mansions on St. Stephen's Green continued to host elaborate dinner parties throughout 1847, while families like the O'Reillys and the Murphys fought for scraps. Dublin's wealthy elite consumed multi-course meals that would have fed entire tenements. For weeks, the contrast wasn't just morally obscene. It was physically visible to anyone walking through the city. Lord Henry Ashworth owned several thousand acres of land outside Dublin and maintained a grand house on Maron Square. During the worst months of the famine, Lord Ashworth's kitchen staff would throw away more food each day than most Dublin families would see in a month. Leftover roasts, stale bread, vegetables that were deemed not quite fresh enough for the masters' table. All of it went into garbage bins while people starved literally outside his gates. But Lord Ashworth wasn't uniquely cruel. He was simply participating in a system that allowed, even encouraged, this level of inequality. The wealthy classes had convinced themselves that the famine was either a natural disaster beyond human control or divine punishment for Irish moral failings. Either way, it wasn't their responsibility to address. This willful blindness created scenes that would have seemed impossible in any rational society. Lady Margaret Pitton, wife of a prominent Dublin merchant, would ride through the city in her ornate carriage, dressed in silk and jewels, passing within feet of families dying in doorways. Her diary entries from this period reveal not horror or compassion, but mild annoyance at the unsightly nature of poverty. She wrote about having to change her usual route to the shops because the streets have become rather unpleasant with so many unfortunate people gathered about. She complained that her dinner parties had become less enjoyable because one can't help but notice the rather distressing sounds from the streets below. She never once wrote about the possibility that she might use her wealth to help the dying people whose suffering she found so aesthetically displeasing. But perhaps the most revealing glimpse into Dublin's social dynamics during the famine came from the servants who worked in these wealthy households. They lived in a unique position, close enough to wealth to see how the other half lived, but poor enough to understand the desperation of the starving masses. Mary Connolly had worked as a kitchen maid in Lord Ashworth's house for 7 years. She earned barely enough to support herself, but compared to the people dying on Dublin streets, she lived like royalty. She had a roof over her head, regular meals, and a small salary that allowed her to occasionally send money to her family. In County Cork, every morning, Mary would prepare elaborate meals for Lord Ashworth and his guests, while her own brother's family was slowly starving in their rural cottage. She would arrange platters of roasted beef, fresh bread, imported wines, and delicate pastries, while knowing that her nephew had died the previous month from hunger. She would serve multiple courses to dinner guests who complained of booth quality of the wine, while her sister wrote desperate letters, begging for any help Mary could provide. The psychological toll of this contradiction nearly drove Mary to madness. She began having nightmares about drowning in food while her family starved. She would wake up screaming, imagining the elaborate meals she prepared were made from the bodies of the people dying outside. Several times she was caught crying while serving dinner, tears falling into the soup bowls of people who had never missed a meal in their lives. The breaking point came when Mary received word that her sister had died, leaving 3 young children orphaned. Mary begged Lord Ashworth for time off to travel to Cork and bring the children to Dublin, where she might find a way to carry for them. Lord Ashworth refused, telling her that her personal problems were not his concern, and that she could easily be replaced if she abandoned her duties. That night, Mary Connolly made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. She began stealing food from Lord Ashworth's kitchen, not for herself, but to distribute to the starving familia she encountered on her way to and from work. Small amounts at first, a few rolls, some leftover meat, vegetables that would otherwise be thrown away. But as her desperation grew, so did her thefts. Mary developed an elaborate system for getting food to the starving. She would wrap small portions in Coffin, hide them in her clothing, then distribute them during her rare moments of free time. She became known in certain neighborhoods as an angel of mercy, appearing with life-saving food when families had given up all hope. But her system couldn't last. One evening in February 1848, Lord Ashworth's cook discovered Mary wrapping bread in her apron. The cook, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had worked for wealthy families for 30 years, faced her own moral crisis. She could report Mary and likely send her to prison, or she could pretend she hadn't seen anything and become complicit in the theft. Mrs. Patterson made her choice. She turned her back and walked away, pretending she had never entered the kitchen. For the next 3 months, she continued to pretend she didn't notice food disappearing from the pantries. She never spoke to Mary about it, never acknowledged what was happening, but she made sure that a certain amount of waste was always available for Mary to redistribute. This small act of rebellion, 2 servants in a wealthy household choosing humanity over duty, saved dozens of lives during those terrible months. The food Mary stole and distributed kept entire families alive long enough for them to find other sources of help, or at least to die with dignity rather than starving in the streets. But even these individual acts of courage and compassion couldn't address the systematic nature of the crisis. Dublin's famine wasn't just about crop failure. It was about a social and economic system that valued property rights over human life, that prioritized over survival, that allowed an entire population to starve while food was literally available. The grain ships that sailed from Dublin's harbor during the worst months of the famine carried enough food to feed the entire city formans. But that grain belonged to English merchants and landowners, and their property rights were considered more sacred than Irish lives. Armed guards protected these shipments while people died of starvation within sight of the docks. Michael Flanagan worked as a dock laborer when there was work to be had, loading and unloading the ships that carried Ireland's wealth away to England. The bitter irony of his situation was never lost on him. He spent his days loading ships with grain. While his own children went hungry at home, he would watch cargo holds filled with thousands of tons of wheat, oats, and barley, all knowing that his family's evening meal would consist of whatever scraps his wife could gather from the streets. The ship's captains and merchants who supervised these operations weren't cruel men in any personal sense. They were simply following the logic of a system that treated food as a commodity to be bought and sold rather than a basic human necessity. When Michael would plead for just a small amount of grain to feed his dying children, they would explain patiently that they couldn't give away property that belonged to their employers. No matter how desperate the circumstances, this adherence to property rights over human life created scenes of almost surreal cruelty. Ships loaded with food would sail past crowds of starving people who begged from the docks. Warehouses full of grain would be heavily guarded while families died off hunger in the streets outside. The legal system that protected these property rights was enforced more strictly during the famine than the laws that were supposed to protect human life. But the most devastating aspect of Dublin's famine experience was the way it destroyed the social bonds that held communities together. Neighbors who had helped each other through generations of hardship began to turn against each other. when survival was at stake. Families split apart when parents could no longer feed all their children. Churches that had been centers of community support became overwhelmed and ineffective in the face of such massive need. The transformation of Dublin's nigords during this period revealed how quickly civilization could break down when basic needs weren't met. Streets that had once been safe for children became dangerous as desperate people fought over scraps of food. Homes that had always been open to neighbors in need were barricaded against potential thieves. Community gatherings that had brought people together for generations stopped happening, as everyone focused solely on individual survival. On Bride Street, a neighborhood that had been known for its strong sense of community, the famine created divisions that would last for generations. Families who had been friends for decades began to suspect each other of hoarding food. Children who had played together were forbidden from visiting each other's homes for fear they might steal whatever meager supplies their hosts possessed. The local pub, which had been a gathering place for the entire neighborhood, closed not because of lack of customers, but because too many fights had broken out over rumors of hidden food or accusations of selfishness. The psychological damage of this social breakdown was as devastating as the physical effects of starvation. People who had defined themselves as generous, community-minded individuals found themselves making choices they never thought possible. Parents chose which children to feed when they couldn't feed them all. Neighbors ignored the cries for help from people they had known their entire lives. Community leaders abandoned their responsibilities to save their own families first. This moral injury, the deep psychological wound that came from betraying one's own values in order to survive, would haunt the survivors of Dublin's famine for the rest of their lives. Even those who eventually escaped to America or found ways to rebuild there. Lives in Ireland carried the scars of the choices they had been forced to make during those terrible months. The children who survived were perhaps the most deeply affected. They had learned lessons about humanity and social reality that no child should ever have to learn. They had seen their parents reduced to desperation, their communities dissolved into chaos, their most basic assumptions about safety and security proven false. These children would grow up to be adults who trusted nothing and no one completely, who hoarded resources, even entities of plenty, who could never again take social stability for granted. But even as Dublin's social fabric was tearing apart, new forms of human connection were emerging from the ruins. People who had lost everything found each other and created makeshift families based on shared survival rather than blood relations. Strangers took in orphan children, not because they could afford to feed them, but because abandoning them felt like a surrender to the forces that were destroying their world. These new communities of serve evaporated by different rules than the society they replaced. Sharing became more important than ownership. Loyalty was earned through actions during crises rather than inherited through family connections. Leadership came to those who could find solutions to immediate problems rather than those who held traditional positions of authority. In the ruins of Dublin's traditional social order, something new was being born. A different understanding of what it meant to be human, what obligations people had to each other, and what values were worth preserving when everything else fell apart. These emerging communities of survival were perhaps most visible in Dublin's abandoned buildings, where people had begun to gather not as neighbors or family members, but as fellow survivors of an unimaginable catastrophe. The old Smithfield Market building, once bustling with commerce, had become a sort of informal refugee center where dozens of families had taken shelter. Among them was Catherine Walsh, a widow in her 40s who had lost her husband to typhus earlier that year. Catherine had no children of her own, but in the market building, she had become the unofficial mother to 7 orphan children whose parents had died or disappeared. These weren't children she had known before the famine. They were simply the ones who had nowhere else to go when she found them wandering Dublin's streets. The youngest was a boy named Paddy, maybe 4 years old, who couldn't remember his last name or where he had lived before. The oldest was Bridge, a girl of 15 who had been caring for her 3 younger siblings until malnutrition made her too weak to work. Catherine had found them huddled together in a doorway on Capel Street, the 3 little ones clinging to Bridge as she slowly lost consciousness from starvation. What made Catherine's makeshift family remarkable wasn't that she had taken in these children. Hundreds of people across Dublin were making similar choices. What was remarkable was how she managed to keep them alive with virtually no resources. Catherine had learned to read Dublin's rhythms in ways that would have been unimaginable before the famine. She knew which bakeries might have day-old bread to throw away, which hospitals might need help with cleaning in exchange for scraps of food, which wealthy households might have servants willing to share leftovers. Every morning, Catherine would assign tasks to the older children while keeping the younger ones safe in their corner of the market building. Bridge, despite her weakness, would venture out to look for work, maybe carrying packages or sweeping steps for a few pence. The 2 middle children, boys named Shaw and Daney, would scavenge for anything useful. Bits of wood for fuel, pieces of cloth for warmth, occasionally a dropped coin or a forgotten vegetable. Catherine herself would spend hours walking through Dublin's streets, not looking for food or money, but studying the patterns of survival that were emerging from the chaos. She watched which families were sharing resources and which were hoarding. She observed how the truly desperate behaved versus those who still had some hope left. She learned to recognize the signs that meant someone was about to die and the different signs that meant they were about to do something desperate to avoid death. This knowledge became her family's lifeline. Catherine could predict where violence might break out over food distribution, allowing her to keep her children away from dangerous situations. She could identify which officials might be sympathetic and which were completely indifferent to suffering. She could tell when someone was lying about having resources to share, and when someone who claimed to have nothing might actually have hiding a small reserve of food. But perhaps most importantly, Catherine learned to navigate the complex web of relationships that had replaced Dublin's traditional social structures. The famine had created new hierarchies, descendant on wealth or family connections, but on access to survival resources. The person who knew which ships might have edible scraps in their refuse was more powerful than the former merchant Woe had lost everything. The woman who could trade her sewing skills for food held more influence than gentleman who could no longer pay his rent. Catherine's children watched her master these new social dynamics, and in doing so, they learned lessons about human nature that would shape their understanding of the world for the rest of their lives. They saw how quickly people could change, from generous to selfish when their own survival was threatened. They witnessed acts of extraordinary kindness from people who had almost nothing to give. They observed the cruel efficiency with which desperation could strip away all the polite pretenses that had once defined social interaction. Young Paddy, the 4-year-old who couldn't remember his real family, began to understand that Catherine wasn't his mother in the way other children had mothers, but that she was something more precious, someone who had chosen to love him when she had no obligation to do so. Bridge learned that survival sometimes required making alliances with people you might not trust in normal circumstance, but that these partnerships could be more reliable than blood relationships everyone was fighting for their lives. But even Catherine's skills couldn't protect her makeshift family from the broader forces that were destroying Dublin. By early 1848, the market building where they had found shelter was becoming too dangerous to inhabit. Fights over space and resources were breaking out regularly, and several people had died, not from starvation or disease, but from violence inflicted by other desperate survivors. The breaking point came when a man named Patrick Doyle, who had been living in the market building with his 2 teenage sons, ACCUSED Catherine, of hoarding food that should have been shared with everyone. Doyle had been watching Catherine's family survive when his own sons were growing weaker each day, and he had convinced himself that she must have access to resources she was keeping secret. The accusation was false. Catherine had no hidden stores of food, no secret sources of income. Her success in keeping her children alive came from knowledge and strategy, not from material resources that could be shared. But Patrick Doyle was beyond rational thinking. Watching his own children starve to death had driven him to a kind of madness that looked for someone to blame, someone to punish for his family's suffering. The confrontation between Catherine and Patrick revealed the terrible psychology of communal starvation. When people are dying slowly from hunger, they can't direct their rage at abstract force like government policy or economic systems. They need someone specific to hate, someone they can see and touch and hold responsible for their pain. Catherine's relative success in keeping her children alive made her a target for the desperate fury of those who were failing to save their own families. The fight that erupted in the market building wasn't just about food. It was about justice, about fairness, about the unbearable psychological burden of watching children die while feeling completely powerless to save them. Patrick Doyle attacked Catherine not because he really believed she was hoarding resources, but because hitting her was the only action he could take that felt like he was fighting back against the forces that were destroying his world. Catherine survived the attack, but barely. Patrick's sons had to pull him away from her before he killed her, and the incident shattered whatever sense of community had existed among the market building's inhabitants. Trust, already fragile, evaporated completely. Families began to sleep in shifts, with someone always awake to guard against potential thieves or attackers. The sharing of information and resources that had helped everyone survive came to an end, and as people retreated into isolated family units focused solely on their own preservation, Catherine made the painful decision to leave the market building and try to find shelter elsewhere. Loading her 7 children into a makeshift cart built from salvaged wood and broken wheels, she joined the stream of people moving constantly through Dublin's streets, searching for safety that seemed to exist nowhere in the entire city. Their journey through Dublin revealed the full extent of how the famine had transformed Ireland's capital. Entire neighborhoods that hadn't bustled with commerce and family life now stood empty except for the occasional scavenger, searching through abandoned buildings for anything useful. The Liberties District, which had been home to thousands of working families, looked like a city that had been struck by plague, which in many ways it had been. The abandoned shops told their own stories of gradual collapse. McGrath's Bakery on Thomas Street still had its sign hanging above the door, but the windows were boarded up, and someone had written, "Gone to America," in charcoal on the wooden boards. Inside, through gaps in the boarding, Catherine could see the remains of what had once been a thriving business. Empty flour barrels, a cold oven, scattered papers that had probably been unpaid bills. Next door, O'Sullivan's grocery had met a different fate. The front windows had been smashed, probably bee-hungry people looking for any food that might have been stripped and left behind. The interior of everything potentially useful. Shelves, fixtures, even the wooden floorboards had been freed up and taken away, probably for fuel. Only the stone walls remained, like the skeleton of some enormous creature that had died and been picked clean by scavengers. But what struck Catherine most powerfully wasn't the empty buildings. It was the silence. Dublin had always been a noisy city full of vendors calling their wares, children playing in the streets, horses and carts clattering over cobblestones, conversations spilling out of pubs and shops. No entire blocks would pass in eerie quiet, broken only by the distant sound of simian coughing, or the scrape of cartwheels as another family moved through the streets searching for shelter. The children walking beside Catherine's cart were learning to read this new version of Dublin like a map of survival possibilities. They could identify which buildings might still have inhabitants who could be approached for help and which were completely abandoned. They learned to recognize the difference between the silence of empty buildings and the silence of buildings where people were hiding, afraid to reveal their presence. They developed an instinct for sensing when a street or neighborhood was becoming dangerous, when the desperation of its inhabitants was reaching the point where violence became likely. Little Paddy, walking beside the carton, his short 4-year-old legs, began to understand that the city itself had become a kind of living creature that was slowly dying. The buildings were like ribs showing through the skin of a starving animal. The empty streets were like the shallow breathing of someone whose lungs were failing. The occasional sounds of life, a baby crying, voices arguing, someone praying, were like the irregular heartbeat of a body that was shutting down. This perception wasn't unique to Pa-D-D-Y-Y. All across Dublin, children were developing ways of understanding their environment that would have been impossible in normal times. They were learning to navigate by instinct and intuition, to sense danger, an opportunity in ways that adults, still clinging to old assumptions about how the world worked, often missed. Bridget had become expert at reading faces, able to tell at a glance whether someone might be willing to help, or was likely to see her family as competition for scarce resources. Shaw and Daney had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot anything potentially useful that others had overlooked. A piece of rope that could be traded, a scrap of metal that could be sold, a discarded piece of clothing that could provide warmth. But perhaps most remarkably, these children were also learning to maintain hope and even joy in circumstances that had driven many adults to despair. They would play games with stones and sticks, create elaborate stories about the abandoned buildings. They passed, find reasons to laugh even when their stomachs were empty and their future uncertain. This resilience wasn't naive optimism. These children understood exactly how precarious their situation was. Rather, it was a kind of emotional survival. Skill, a way of preserving their humanity in circumstances designed to strip away everything that made life worth living. They were learning that hope itself could be a form of resistance against forces that were trying to destroy them. Catherine watched her makeshift children adapt to their circumstance and felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak. She was proud of their strength, their cleverness, their ability to find light in the darkest possible circumstances. But she was heartbroken that they were being forced to develop these skills at all. That childhood itself had become a luxury that Dublin's children could no longer afford. As they continued their journey through empty streets, Catherine began to understand that they weren't just searching for physical shelter. They were looking for some place where these children could remember what it felt like to be children, where they could play and learn and dream about futures that extended beyond mere survival. But finding such a place in 1848, Dublin seemed almost impossible. Every institution that might have provided safety and care was overwhelmed. Every neighborhood that might have offered community was fractured by desperation. Every adult who might have provided protection was struggling with their own family's survival. The search for sanctuary led Catherine's family to St. Patrick's Cathedral, where they hoped to find not just physical shelter, but some remnant of the moral order that had once made Dublin feel like a civilized place. What they found instead was a microcosm of everything that was breaking down throughout the city. The cathedral steps were crowded with families in situations identical to Catherine's. Parents or guardians trying to protect children in circumstances that made protection nearly impossible. But instead of creating solidarity among people facing the same challenges, the concentration of desperate families had created intense competition and suspicion. Arguments broke out regularly over who had the right to sleep in which spots on the cathedral steps. Accusations flew about families taking more than their fair share of whatever charitable donations might appear. Children were warned not to play with children from other families, not because of old prejudices about class or religion, but because trust had become too dangerous when survival was at stake. Father William Murphy, the cathedral's elderly priest, tried to maintain some sense of order and Christian charity, but he was overwhelmed by the scope of need and the intensity of desperation. His small fund for helping the poor had been exhausted. Months earlier, his storage rooms, which had once held surplus food for distribution to needy families, now stood empty. Even his personal possessions had been given away or sold to buy food for the starving families who gathered at his church. Every day what tormented Father Murphy most wasn't the material poverty. He had expected that the famine would create physical hardship. What broke his heart was watching the spiritual and moral poverty that extreme desperation was creating among his parishioners. People who had been generous and kind in better times were now suspicious and selfish. Families who had once helped their neighbors were now competing with them for scraps. Children who had been taught to share and be considerate were learning to grab what they could get before someone else took it. Father Murphy's sermons during this period reflected his struggle to find religious meaning in circumstances that seemed to mock every traditional teaching about divine providence and justice. How could he tell starving parents that God loved their children when those children were dying from hunger? How could he preach about charity and forgiveness to people who were fighting each other for crusts of bread? How could he speak of hope and faith to families who had watched their loved ones waste away despite prayers and devotion? The crisis of faith that Father Murphy experienced was being repeated in churches across Dublin. Religious leaders who had spent their entire careers providing spiritual comfort, people facing ordinary human problems, found themselves completely unprepared for the theological challenges posed by systematic starvation. The traditional explanations for suffering, that it was a test of faith or divine punishment for sin or part of God's mysterious plan, seemed inadequate when applied to the death of innocent children from preventable hunger. Some priests and ministers began to preach that the famine was indeed divine punishment for Irish sins, particularly the sin of depending too heavily on a single crop instead of trusting in God's providence. But this explanation provided no comfort to the dying and no practical guidance for the living. Other religious leaders abandoned theological explanations entirely and focused on practical relief efforts, turning their churches into soup kitchens and homeless shelters without worrying about the spiritual implications. Father Murphy chose a third path that was perhaps the most difficult of all. He continued to preach about God's love and justice, but he acknowledged honestly that he didn't understand how these divine attributes were compatible with the suffering he witnessed every day. His sermons became conversations rather than pronouncements, invitations for his parishioners to struggle together with questions that had no easy answers, rather than declarations of certainty that rang false in the face of their daily reality. This theological honesty created a different kind of community among the families gathered at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Instead of competing for limited resources while maintaining the pretense that they were all faithful Christians following divine commandments, they began to acknowledge openly that they were all struggling to maintain their humanity in circumstances that made traditional morality nearly impossible to practice. Catherine found herself drawn into these conversations, not because she had answers to offer, but because the questions being raised reflected her own daily struggle to care for her children, while maintaining some sense of who she was as a person. How do you teach children to be generous when generosity might mean their own starvation? How do you maintain hope when every piece of evidence suggests that hope is foolish? How do you preserve dignity when survival requires actions that violate your deepest values? These weren't abstract theological questions. They were practical problems that Catherine faced every single day as she tried to keep 7 children alive in a city where childhood itself had become a form of slow suicide. Every decision she made carried moral weight it would have been unimaginable in normal circumstances. Should she trade away a piece of clothing that might keep little Patty warm in order to buy food that might keep all the children alive for Rome? More day? Should she send Bridge to beg in wealthy neighborhoods, knowing that the humiliation might damage the girl's spirit, but that the money might save her life? The other familiars scared at the cathedral were facing identical moral dilemmas and gradually began to share not just resources, but the burden of these impossible choices, instead of each parent or guardian struggling alone with decisions. That could mean life or death for their children. They began to make collective choices that distributed both the practical consequences and the moral responsibility among the entire group. This communal approach to survival created something that hadn't existed in Dublin since the famine began. A genuine community based on shared vulnerability rather than shared prosperity. The families sleeping on St. Patrick's Cathedral steps weren't brought together by neighborhood ties or family connections or common interests. They were united by their common experience of watching the world they had known collapse around them while they fought to protect the people they loved most. But even this fragile community couldn't protect them from the larger forces that were reshaping Dublin. By the spring of 1848, the British government's relief efforts had shifted from providing direct aid to encouraging immigration. The message was clear. Ireland couldn't support its population, so the surplus people should leave for America, Canada, or Australia. This policy created a new form of heartbreak for families who had managed to survive the worst of the famine. Just when they had learned to live with minimal resources, just when they had created new forms of community and support, they were being told that their only hope for a real future lay in abandoning Ireland entirely. The immigration ships that docked at Dublin's harbor offered passage to America for anyone who could pay the fare or work off the cost during the voyage. For families like Catherine's, these ships represented both salvation and destruction, the possibility of life, but only at the cost of leaving behind everything they had ever known. Catherine spent weeks agonizing over this decision. The children in her care weren't legally hers, which meant she had no official right to take them out of the country. But they also had neither family members who could care for them, which meant that leaving them behind would sentence them to almost certain death. The bureaucratic complexities of immigration laws seemed designed to separate families and abandon children, even in circumstances where such separations serve no purpose except to create additional suffering. The moral complexity of the immigration decision was multiplied by the conditions on the ships themselves. These vessels, which would later be known as coffin ships, were overcrowded, unsanitary, and dangerous. Many passengers died during the voyage from diseases that spread rapidly. In their cramped conditions, others arrived in America so weak from the journey that they died shortly after landing. Immigration offered hope, but it was hope purchased at the price of enormous risk and almost certain trauma. Catherine's decision was ultimately made for her by events beyond her control. The building where they had been sheltering near St. Patrick's Cathedral was condemned by city officials who declared it unsafe for habitation. The families sleeping on the cathedral steps were told they would have to move elsewhere. But elsewhere had become a concept without meaning in a city where every potential shelter was already overcrowded. Faced with the choice between certain starvation in Dublin and possible survival in America, Catherine made the decision that thousands of other Irish families were making that spring. She gathered her 7 children, sold everything they possessed to raise money for ship passage, and joined the stream of immigrants heading for Dublin's harbor. The children's reactions to this decision revealed how profoundly the famine had changed their understanding of home, family, and future. Little Patty, who couldn't remember life before the famine, was excited by the prospect of adventure on a big ship. Bridge, who remembered better times and understood what they were leaving behind, wept quietly as they walked toward the harbor, The middle children fell somewhere between excitement and grief. Old enough to understand loss, but young. Enough to believe in the possibility of new beginnings. But as they approached Dublin's harbor and saw the immigrant ships waiting at anchor, all of the children fell silent. The reality of what they were about to do: leave Ireland forever. Cross an ocean to a country they knew nothing about. Trust there. Lives to a ship that looked barely suddenly became overwhelming, even for children who had already survived experiences that would traumatize adults. The harbor itself had become another microcosm of Famine Island, crowded with families saying final goodbyes to relatives who were staying behind, arguing with ship officials about passage costs and baggage restrictions, and trying to comfort children who were crying for homes they would never see again. The sounds were a mixture of Irish, English, and languages Catherine couldn't identify. Immigrants from other parts of Europe who were also fleeing poverty and seeking new lives across the Atlantic. Catherine's makeshift family joined this crowd of displaced people. And for the first time since the famine began, the children saw that their suffering wasn't unique to Dublin or even to Ireland. The ship they would board was carrying Polish families fleeing political persecution, German farmers whose crops had failed, Scottish Highlanders who had been forced off their land by wealthy landowners. The famine that had destroyed their world was part of a larger pattern of displacement and desperation that was reshaping populations across Europe. This realization was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant they weren't alone in their suffering, that their experiences were part of something larger than individual tragedy. Terrifying because it suggested that the problems they were fleeing weren't temporary disasters that would eventually be resolved, but fundamental changes in the way the world worked that would affect millions of people for generations to come, as they waited to board the ship that would carry them away from Ireland forever. Catherine's children looked back at Dublin one last time. The city that had been their home, their prison, their school and survival, and their introduction to the darkest aspects of human nature was disappearing in them. They were leaving behind not just a place, but an entire version of themselves, the people they had been before. Hunger taught them that civilization was more fragile than they had ever imagined. But they were also carrying something with them that couldn't be taken away by poverty or starvation or even exile. They had learned that love could survive circumstances that destroyed everything else, that communities could be created from nothing more than shared vulnerability, that hope could persist even when hope seemed foolish. They had discovered reserves of strength and resilience that they never knew they possessed. And they had seen ordinary people perform extraordinary acts of courage and kindness under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The ship's whistle blew, signaling that it was time to board. Catherine gathered her 7 children around her one last time on Irish soil and made them a promise that she wasn't sure she could keep, but knew she had to make anyway. She promised that no matter what happened during the voyage, no matter what they found in America, no matter how difficult their new life became, they would remain a family, not because of blood or law or tradition, but because they had chosen each other when choice was the only thing they had left. As they walked up the gangplank of the immigrant ship, Catherine's children were leading behind the Dublin that had almost killed them, but had also taught them everything they would ever need to know about survival, love, and the complex relationships between individuals' learning and collective responsibility. They were carrying the lessons of Famine Street with them into an uncertain future, armed with knowledge that no school could have taught them, and wisdom that no textbook could have provided. The Dublin they left behind would eventually recover from the famine, but it would never again be the same city it had been before 1845. The empty buildings would be filled with new inhabitants. The silent streets would again echo with commerce and conversation. The abandoned nagurds would be rebuilt and repopulated. But the people who lived through Dublin's famine years would never forget what they had learned about the fragility of civilization and the strength of human bonds, forged in circumstances that tested every assumption about what people owed each, other and what survival really meant. The ship Catherine and her children boarded was called the Sarah Ann, and it would become their home for the next 6 weeks as they crossed the Atlantic Ocean. But even as they sailed away from Dublin's harbor, the stories of those who remained behind continued to unfold in ways that revealed just how deeply the famine had changed not just individual lives, but the very soul of Ireland itself. Back in the city they had left behind, Dr. James Crawford was still working at Meath Hospital, though by now he barely recognized the institution where he had once practiced medicine. Hospital had become something between a morgue and a refugee camp, filled with people who were beyond medical help, but had nowhere else to die. Dr. Crawford's journal entries from summer of 1848 capture the complete breakdown of everything he had understood about healing and hope. He wrote about patients who begged him not to waste medicine on them because they knew younger people had better chances of survival. He described children who had become so accustomed to hunger that they no longer cried when their stomachs ached, simply lying in their beds with the patience of old people who had accepted their fate. But perhaps most disturbing to Dr. Crawford were the patients who survived against all medical logic, their bodies somehow continuing to function long after they should have died. These skeletal figures would appear in his word, their skin stretched, tight over protruding bones, their eyes enormous in faces that had lost all trace of the people they had once been. They would live for weeks or even months in this condition, neither dying nor recovering, existing in a state between life and death that seemed to mock everything. Dr. Crawford had learned about human biology. One such patient was an elderly woman named Nora Fitzgerald who had been brought to the hospital by her grandson after she collapsed in the street. Nora weighed perhaps 70, her body so wasted that Dr. Crawford could see every bone in her rib cage through her translucent skin. By all medical knowledge, she should have died within days of her arrival. Instead, Nora lingered for 3 months, conscious and aware, but unable to do anything except lie in her bed and watch world around her. She couldn't eat solid food, could barely swallow liquids, and had no strength to move more than her eyes and fingers. Yet somehow, her heart continued beating, her lungs continued drawing breath, her mind remained sharp enough to recognize visitors and respond to questions. Dr. Crawford found himself visiting Nora every day, not because there was any treatment he could provide, but because her impossible survival had become a kind of mystery that haunted him. What was keeping this woman alive when every biological indicator suggested she should be dead? Was it pure stubbornness? Some reservoir that medical science couldn't measure? Was it fear of death? Or perhaps fear of leaving behind the few, people who still depended on her? Or was it something else entirely? Some aspect of human existence that his training had never taught him to recognize? Nora herself couldn't answer these questions, but she became a kind of oracle for the other patients in the ward. People would whisper to her about their fears, their regrets, their desperate hopes for their family's survival. She would listen, with those enormous eyes, and occasionally note her squeeze a hand, providing comfort that had nothing to do with medicine, and everything to do with the simple fact that she continued to exist, when existence itself had become an act of defiance. The day Nora finally died. Dr. Nora finally. Crawford wrote in his journal that he felt like he was witnessing the end of something larger than one old woman's life. Her death marked the moment when he stopped believing that medicine could address the crisis he was witnessing. The famine wasn't a medical problem that could be solved with treatments and procedures. It was a social catastrophe that revealed the limitations of every institution that was supposed to protect human life. But while Dr. Crawford was losing faith in the power of medicine, other people in Dublin were discovering new forms of strength. in the most unlikely places. The workhouse system, which had been designed to control and punish the poor, was being transformed by the people forced to live within it into something resembling a genuine community. The Dublin Union Workhouse, still overcrowded beyond all reasonable capacity, had become home to people like Margaret Ryan, a woman in her 30s who had arrived with her infant daughter after her husband died of typhus. Margaret had expected the workhouse to be a place of despair and degradation, and in many ways it was. The conditions were appalling. The work was grueling. The rules were designed to break people's spirits along with their bodies. But Margaret discovered that the women's section of the workhouse had developed its own underground economy based not on money or official authority, but on skills, knowledge, and emotional support. The women who had been teachers before the famine taught reading and writing to those who had never learned. The women who had been seamstresses repaired clothes and created new garments from scraps of fabric. The women who had been mothers to large families shared their knowledge of child care with younger women who were struggling to keep their babies alive. Most importantly, the women had created an informal system for sharing both resources and emotional burdens. When someone received a letter from a relative in America, the entire section would gather to hear the news and discuss what it might mean for their own hopes of immigration. When someone's child died, the other women would take turns, sitting with the grieving mother, ensuring that she was never alone with her sorrow. When new arrivals appeared, confused and terrified by their circumstances, experienced residents would quietly explain how to navigate the workhouse rules and where to find the small comforts that made life bearable. Margaret's infant daughter, little Mary, became something like a mascot for the entire women's section. The baby represented hope in a place designed to destroy hope, proof that life could continue, even in circumstances that seemed to make life impossible. The women who had lost their own children would take turns holding Mary, singing to her, playing games that made her laugh. Those who still had older children would tell stories about Mary to comfort their sons and daughters during the brief visiting hours when families were allowed to see each other. But Mary also represented the terrible mathematics of survival that haunted every decision in the workhouse. Margaret's milk production was failing because of her own malnutrition, and the workhouse authorities provided barely enough food to keep adults alive, much less nursing mothers. Margaret faced the same impossible choice that countless mothers were confronting across Ireland: watch her child slowly starve, or find some way to get more nutrition, even if it meant breaking rules that could result in punishment or expulsion. The other women in Margaret's section understood this dilemma intimately because most of them had faced similar choices with their own children. They developed an elaborate system for secretly sharing food with women who had slightly larger portions, passing small amounts to nursing mothers and mothers who had lost children, giving their rations to those still trying to keep babies alive. This sharing system required incredible coordination and risk management. The workhouse authorities prohibited any redistribution of food rations, and anyone caught sharing could face a solitary confinement, reduced meals, or expulsion from the institution. The women had to time their exchanges perfectly, coordinate their stories if questioned, and maintain absolute silence about their activities, even when talking to family members during visiting hours. But the system worked, and it kept babies like Mary alive when official policies would have sentenced them to death. More importantly, it created bonds of trust and mutual support that gave the women something to live for beyond mere physical survival. Weren't just enduring the workhouse. They were transforming it into a place where human dignity could survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances. Margaret's experience in the workhouse taught her lessons about community and resistance that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She learned that authority, based on power rather than consent, could be quietly subverted by people who were willing to take risks for each other. She discovered that institutions designed to break human spirits often failed because they underestimated people's capacity to create meaning and connection, even in the most hostile environments. Most importantly, Margaret learned that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about preserving the parts of yourself that made life worth living. The women in the workhouse who shared their food weren't just feeding each other's bodies. They were nourishing each other's souls, maintaining their capacity for love and generosity, even when love and generosity seemed like luxuries they couldn't afford. But even as some people were finding ways to create community and meaning within the famine's devastation, others were being driven to acts that revealed just how completely the crisis had shattered normal moral boundaries. In the countryside around Dublin, stories were emerging that would haunt Ireland's collective memory for generations. Patrick O'Sullivan had been a respectable farmer in County Dublin, known throughout his parish as a man of strong character and deep religious faith. He owned 30 acres of good land, employed several workers during harvest season, and had raised 6 children who were the pride of the local community. Patrick's wife, Kathleen, was famous for her skill at healing sick animals and helping women through difficult childbirths. The potato blight destroyed Patrick's crops completely in both 1845 and 1846, but he managed to keep his family alive by selling his livestock, his farm equipment, and eventually portions of his land. By the spring of 1847, Patrick owned only 5 acres and had no animals, no tools, and no money. But he still had his family, and he believed that if they could just survive until the next harvest, they might be able to rebuild their lives. That hope was destroyed when his landlord, a man named Sir Robert Henderson, who lived in England and had never set foot on Patrick's farm, decided to evict all his Irish tenants and convert the land to cattle grazing. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in June 1847, giving Patrick and his family exactly 1 week to vacate the land that had been his family for 3 generations. Patrick pleaded with Henderson's local agent, explaining that his family would literally die if they were forced to leave their home with nowhere to go. The agent, a man named William Thompson, who had grown wealthy managing properties for absentee English landlords, listened politely to Patrick's appeal and then explained that business was business. The land would be more profitable as pasture than as tenant farms, and Henderson's only obligation was to maximize the return on his investment. On the appointed day, Thompson arrived with a crew of men to physically remove the O'Sullivan family from their home. Patrick's wife and children were forced to watch as their house was demolished, their furniture destroyed, and their few remaining possessions scattered in the dirt. Within 2 hours, everything that had defined their life for generations was reduced to a pile of rubble and broken boards. The O'Sullivan family joined the thousands of other evicted families wandering the roads around Dublin, searching for shelter, work, or charity that might keep them alive. They slept in ditches, under bridges, in abandoned buildings that provided no protection from wind or rain. They ate grass, tree bark, anything that might fill their stomachs and quiet the constant ache of hunger. Within a month, Patrick's youngest son, a boy named Shaw, who was 8 years old, died of exposure and starvation. They buried him beside a road outside the town of Lucan, marking his grave with a pile of stones because they had nothing else to use as a marker. 2 weeks later, Patrick's eldest daughter, Catherine, who was 16 and had been the strongest member of the family, collapsed while searching for edible plants and never regained consciousness. Each death broke something inside Patrick that couldn't be repaired. The man who had once been known for his faith and moral strength began to change in ways that terrified even his own family. He started talking about revenge against Sir Robert Henderson, about finding ways to make the landlord pay for the deaths of his children. His wife Kathleen watched her husband transform from a loving father and community leader into someone she barely recognized, consumed by rage. obsessed with fantasies of violence, losing his grip on the values that had once defined his character. The breaking point came when the third child, a daughter named Bridget, who was 12 years old, became too weak to walk. Patrick looked at Bridget's skeletal form and made a decision that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. He abandoned her by the side of the road, telling his wife and surviving children that they couldn't afford to carry someone who would slow them down and consume resources they needed for their own survival. Kathleen begged Patrick to reconsider, argued that they couldn't leave their own daughter to die alone, reminded him of the man he had once been and the values he had once held sacred. But Patrick had moved beyond the reach of moral arguments. His world had been reduced to the simple mathematics of survival. Who could contribute to the family's chances of living through another day, and who had become a burden that would drag them all toward death? They left Bridget sitting beside a stone wall outside the village of Clondalkin, promising to come back for her when they found shelter and food. It was a lie, and everyone knew it was a lie, but it was the only way Patrick could bring himself to walk away from his daughter. Bridget was found 3 days later by a passing priest, but she died in his arms before he could bring her to safety. Patrick O'Sullivan's story was repeated thousands of times across Ireland during the famine years with variations that reflected the different ways that extreme desperation could destroy people's moral foundations. Fathers abandoned children they couldn't feed. Mothers chose which babies to save when they couldn't save them all. Families turned against each other when survival seemed to require it. Communities that had shared resources for generations began hoarding food while their neighbors starved. These weren't evil people making evil choices. They were ordinary human beings, pushed beyond the limits of what any person should have to endure, forced to make decisions that violated everything they believed about right and wrong. The famine didn't just kill bodies. It killed souls, destroying people's sense of who they were and what they valued most deeply. But even in the midst of this moral catastrophe, there were people who managed to maintain their humanity, despite facing identical pressures. The difference wasn't that some people were stronger or more virtuous than others. It was often a matter of tiny margins, small advantages, or simple luck that allowed some families to avoid the most impossible choices. Bridget Connolly was a widow who lived in a tiny cottage outside Dublin with her 4 grandchildren, whose parents had died of typhus early in the famine. Bridget faced the same pressures as Patrick O'Sullivan. Too many mouths to feed, no source of income, eviction notices from landlords who needed to maximize their profits. But a series of small breaks allowed her family to survive without abandoning their core values. A neighbor who was immigrating to America gave Bridget his family's remaining food supplies rather than letting them rot. A local priest found temporary work for Bridget's oldest grandchild, a boy named Michael, who was 14 and strong enough to help with farm labor. A merchant in Dublin needed someone to clean his shop in exchange for day-old bread and occasional scraps of meat. None of these opportunities provided enough resources to make Bridget's family comfortable or secure. They were still hungry, still cold, still living day to day, without any guarantee that they would survive the next week. But these small advantages gave them just enough margin to avoid the most desperate choices to maintain their sense of themselves. As people hokered for each other and helped their neighbors when possible, Bridget's story illustrates one of the cruelest aspects of the famine: how arbitrary the line could be between maintaining your humanity and losing it completely. Families that were almost identical in their circumstances, their values, and their efforts to survive could end up on opposite sides of that line based on tiny differences in luck, opportunity. This randomness made the famine's psychological impact even more devastating than its physical effects that people couldn't protect themselves through hard work, careful planning, or moral behavior. Good people suffered and died, while others no more deserving managed to survive. Parents who sacrifice everything for their children watched those children die anyway, while other families somehow found ways to keep everyone alive, despite facing identical challenges. The unfairness of it all drove some people to despair, others to rage, and still others to a kind of fatalistic acceptance that bordered on madness. Father O'Connell at St. Ordowan's Church wrote in his private journal about parishioners who had stopped believing in divine justice, human progress, or any kind of meaningful order in the universe. They continued to go through the motions of daily life, but with the mechanical behavior of people who no longer expected life to make sense. Yet even in this spiritual wasteland, unexpected moments of grace and beauty continued to emerge. People who had lost everything would still share what little they had with strangers. Children who had witnessed horrors that would traumatize adults would still play and laugh and create games from whatever materials they could find. Communities that had been shattered by competition and suspicion would suddenly come together to help a family in crisis or to celebrate a moment of good fortune. These moments didn't last long, and they didn't solve the fundamental problems that were destroying Ireland, but they served as reminders that human nature contained possibilities for love and generosity that could survive even the most extreme circumstances. They suggested that the darkness of the famine years wasn't the whole truth about what people were capable of, even when pushed to their absolute limits. In the autumn of 1848, nearly 3 years after the first potato crop failures, Dublin began to show signs that the worst of the crisis might be passing. Ships carrying grain and other food supplies were arriving more regularly. Government relief programs, inadequate as they were, had been expanded to reach more people. Most importantly, the potato crop that year was healthier than it had been since 1844, offering hope that Ireland's primary food source might be recovering from the disease that had destroyed it. But recovery from a catastrophe like the Great Famine couldn't happen quickly or simply. The physical infrastructure of Irish society had been severely damaged. Hundreds of thousands of people had died, and hundreds of thousands more had immigrated, leaving behind empty villages and abandoned farms, not the social bonds that held communities together had been stretched and broken in ways that would take generations to repair. Dublin's population in late 1848 was dramatically different from what it had been just 3 years earlier. Many of the original residents had died or left for America. Their places had been taken by rural families who had fled to the city seeking opportunities that often didn't exist. These new Dubliners brought different customs, different expectations, different ways of organizing their lives and relating to their neighbors. The result was a city that looked familiar from the outside, but functioned very differently from the Dublin that had existed before the famine. Traditional neighborhood networks had been disrupted by death and displacement, old patterns of employment, and commerce had been replaced by new arrangements that reflected the changed circumstance. Even the physical appearance of many neighborhoods had been altered by the abandonment and demolition of buildings whose owners or tenants could no longer maintain them. But perhaps most significantly, the people who remained in Dublin carried with them the psychological and spiritual scars of experiences that had pushed them beyond what they thought possible. They had learned things about human nature, social organization, and individual survival that couldn't be unlearned. They had seen their deepest assumptions about fairness, community, and the meaning of life tested and often shattered by events beyond their control. These survivors faced the challenge of rebuilding not just their material lives, but their sense of who they were and what they could believe about the world. How do you trust your neighbors after you've seen desperation turn friends into enemies? How do you plan for the future after you've learned how quickly security can disappear? How do you maintain hope after you've witnessed suffering that seem to serve no purpose and follow no logic? The answers to these questions would shape Ireland for Generations to come, the famine survivors and their children would carry forward both the trauma of what they had endured and the strength they had discovered in themselves during the worst of times. They would create new forms of community based on their shared understanding of how fragile civilization could be. They would pass down to their descendants both a deep suspicion of authority and an equally deep commitment to helping each other survive whatever challenges might come. The children who grew up during the famine years would become adults with a different relationship to risk, security, and social obligation than previous generations had known. They would be more likely to immigrate when opportunities arose, less likely to trust institutions that claimed to protect them, more likely to maintain strong family and community ties as insurance against future disasters. But they would also be more likely to recognize genuine courage when they saw it, more appreciative of simple pleasures like adequate food and safe shelter, more aware of their connections to people they might never meet but whose welfare affected their own. The famine had taught them that individual survival was often impossible without collective support, and that collective survival required individuals willing to make sacrifices for the common good. These lessons would travel with Irish immigrants to America, Australia, Canada, and other destinations around the world. The Irish diaspora created by the famine would carry with it a particular understanding of what it meant to be human in circumstances that tested every assumption about dignity, community, and hope. This understanding will influence not just Irish American communities, but the broader societies they joined and helped to shape. Back in Dublin, as 1848 turned into 1849, the city began the slow process of building itself around the people who had survived. New businesses opened to serve the changed population. New institutions emerged to address problems that the famine had revealed or created. New forms of politics developed around the recognition that the disaster had been caused not just by natural forces, but by human choices about how society should be organized and who deserved protection during times of crisis. The Dublin that emerged from this process was neither the city that had existed before 1845, nor a completely new creation. It was something more complex, a place that had been fundamentally transformed by catastrophe, but that maintained threads of continuity with its past. The stories that people told about the famine years became part of the city's identity, shaping how Dubliners understood themselves and their obligations to each other. These stories weren't just historical records. They were moral instruction about what human beings owed each other and what kinds of behavior were acceptable when survival was at stake. They served as warnings about how quickly civilization could collapse, and as inspiration about the forms of courage and generosity that could emerge from the most difficult circumstances. The children who had survived the famine would grow up to be the leaders, workers, parents, and community members who would shape Dublin's future. They would make decisions based not just on their immediate interests, but on their memories of what it felt like to be completely vulnerable and dependent on the kindness of others. They would create institutions, support policies, and maintain traditions that reflected their hard-won understanding of how precious and fragile human dignity could be. The story of Dublin's famine years would become part of Ireland's national narrative, but it would also remain intensely local and personal. Every family had its own version of the story, its own catalog of losses and survivals, its own understanding of what the crisis had meant, and what lessons should be drawn from it. These individual stories would be passed down through generations, creating a collective memory that was both unified and diverse, both specifically Irish and universally human. In the years that followed, as Dublin continued to rebuild and Ireland slowly recovered from the worst disaster in its modern history, people would continue to walk the streets where Catherine and her children had once searched for shelter, where Dr. Crawford had watched patients die from preventable causes, where Father O'Connell had struggled to find meaning in systematic suffering. These streets would again fill with the sounds of commerce and conversation, children's laughter and vendors' calls. But those who remembered the famine years would always be aware of thessalents that lay beneath these familiar sounds. The memory of empty streets and abandoned buildings, of families that had simply disappeared, of communities that had been scattered by forces beyond their control. This awareness would make them more grateful for ordinary pleasures and more determined to protect social bonds that made civilized life possible. The famine had ended, but its lessons would echo through Irish history for generations to come, shaping how people understood their relationships to each other and their responsibilities in times of crisis. The streets of Dublin would tell news stories, but they would never forget the stories of hunger, loss, survival, and the complex forms of love that had sustained life during Ireland's darkest years. The lessons carved into Dublin's Scobiltonis during those terrible years would reshape not just individual families, but the very soul of a nation. As we reach the end of our journey through Famine Street, it becomes clear that what happened in Dublin between 1845 and 1849 was more than just a humanitarian disaster. It was a completransformation of what it meant to be Irish, what it meant to be human, and what it meant to survive when survival itself became an act of rebellion. But there's one final story we need to tell, one that captures everything we value, witnessed in these dark streets, and brings us to understand why the Great Famine didn't just end. It evolved into something that would define Ireland forever. Meet Can McCarthy, a man who would become known throughout Dublin, not for what he lost during the famine, but for what he chose to do with what remained in the winter of 1848, as the worst of the crisis was finally beginning to ease. Made a decision that would echo through generations of Irish memory. Sean had been a successful grain merchant before the famine struck. He owned a warehouse on the LFY, employed dozens of workers, and provided for a large extended family. That included not just his wife and children, but elderly parents, unmarried sisters, and the widows of his brothers who had died in industrial accidents. When the potato blight hit, Sean initially thought his grain business would protect his family from the worst effects of the crisis. He was catastrophically wrong. As the famine deepened, Sean discovered that his grain warehouse had become both a blessing and a curse. He had food when others were starving, but that food belonged to English merchants who expected it to be shipped across the Irish Sea, regardless of local conditions. Armed guards protected his warehouse while families died of hunger just outside its walls. Every day, San would unlock the doors to his business and walk past skeletal figures, begging for just a handful of grain that filled his storage rooms to overflowing. The moral weight of this situationally drove Sean to madness. He was simultaneously one of Dublin's most prosperous citizens and one of its most tormented. He had the resources to save hundreds of lives. But using those resources would mean stealing from his English clients and destroying his business. Every grain of wheat he gave away was a grain that belonged to someone else. But every grain he shipped to England was food that could have kept an Irish child alive for another day. For months, Shaw tried to find compromises that would ease his conscience without destroying his livelihood. He made small donations to local relief efforts. He hired unemployed men for unnecessary work around his warehouse, paying them wages they could use to buy food. He allowed families to shelter in the unused corners of his building during the worst weather. But none of these gestures addressed the fundamental contradiction of his position. He was profiting from a system that was killing his neighbors. The breaking point came on a February morning in 1848 when Sion arrived at his warehouse to find a woman named Mary Donovan collapsed against his front door. Mary was holding her infant son, and both of them were clearly dying from starvation. The baby's lips had turned blue from cold and hunger. Mary herself was so weak, She could barely lift her head to look at Shion as he approached. Mary whispered, "A single word, please." Sean looked at this dying mother and child, and looked at his warehouse, filled with enough grain to feed half of Dublin, and something inside him snapped. Not toward despair or rage, but toward a kind of moral clarity that cut through months of agonizing indecision. He unlocked his warehouse doors and began giving away everything inside. Not selling it at reduced prices, not distributing it through official relief channels, simply giving it away bag by bag to anyone who needed it. Word spread through Dublin streets like wildfire. Within hours, hundreds of people had gathered outside Sean's warehouse. By evening, thousands were lined up in orderly queues that stretched for blocks in every direction. Can's wife, Brid, arrived at the warehouse that afternoon, expecting to find her husband conducting normal business. Instead, she found him personally handing sacks of grain to people who looked like they had risen from their deathbeds. She watched him lift children who were too weak to stand, help elderly people who could barely walk, embrace strangers who wept. With gratitude at receiving food they had thought they would never taste again, Bridget could have stopped him. She could have reminded him that the grain belonged to their English clients, that giving it away would bankrupt their family, that he had obligations to his own wife and children that should come before his obligations to strangers. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves and began helping him distribute food to people who were literally starving to death. The McCarthy family gave away their entire fortune in 3 days. Every grain of wheat, every sack of oats, every barrel of flour that had been destined for English tables was instead used to save Irish lives. They didn't keep detailed records of who received what, didn't require proof of need, didn't impose conditions or requirements. They simply gave food to hungry people until there was no more food to give. On the third day, as the last of the grain was being distributed, representatives of the English merchants arrived with legal documents and police escorts. They informed Shion that he was being arrested for theft, that his property was being seized to compensate his clients, that his family would be held responsible for debts that would take generations to repay. Shin listened to these charges calmly, then looked around at the hundreds of people who were alive because of what he had done and smiled. As the police led him away, something remarkable happened. The people who had received grain from Can's warehouse didn't disperse. Instead, they formed a protective circle around Bridget and her children, making it clear that anyone who threatened the McCarthy family would have to deal with hundreds of grateful neighbors. The English merchants realized that their legal victory had become a public relations disaster, and they quietly decided not to pursue charges against a man who had become a folk hero overnight. Sheen McCarthy never rebuilt this grain business. Instead, he became something more valuable, a living symbol of what it meant to choose humanity over profit, community over individual success, moral courage over legal obligation. Stories about the merchant who gave away everything to save his neighbors spread far beyond Dublin, carried by immigrants to America and Australia, told and retold in kitchens and pubs wherever Irish people gathered. But Can's story wasn't unique. During the famine years, it was simply the most dramatic example of a choice that thousands of Irish people were making in smaller ways every day. The crisis had forced everyone to decide what they valued most when everything else was stripped away. Some chose self-preservation at any cost. Others chose to maintain their humanity, even when humanity seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. These individual choices